multiple opportunities that we have in trade should also be open to women. We cannot forget the challenge of climate change. In our region, it is seen that the greatest problems will affect those that depend on agricultural activities and coastal activities. Children, especially indigenous people, and also island states, and especially women. Women are being affected severely by the effects of climate change. We want to see more policies that are focused on gender to mitigate the effects of climate change within this area. And let's continue to talk about these matters in the Ministry of the Environment and the Ministry of Women, making sure that women have a central role to be able to seek out solutions to this global challenge. Dear authorities and representatives of civil society, we have many intense working days before us, and we hope this will also be the opportunity to celebrate and to honor this space that has been around for several decades in many different types of circumstances, and it is the result of the willpower of women who have become leaders inside our governments and have been focusing on this cause. And I would like to greet the many people who have helped us to represent the government of Chile when she was the Minister of Gender Equality and of Women. So let's have a round of applause for Laura. Thank you very much for being here. I am sure that the next few days, with respect to all of our differences, we will privilege transversal commitments in order to advance and respond to what millions of women in Latin America and the Caribbean are waiting for, so that their right to be able to integrate into all areas with equality will be recognized, with safety, with opportunities, and with equality. I hope that on Friday we'll be celebrating right here that we have taken a step forward on this path with the Santiago commitments, and we'll be able to sign commitments where gender equality will no longer be our objective, it will be a reality. Thank you very much.
Muchas gracias.
Thank you, Minister. And now, Sylvia Rox, Resident Coordinator of the UN System in Chile. Thank you. I would like to begin by thanking the Executive Secretary of ECLAC, Alicia Bárcena. Thank you for inviting me to the inauguration of this regional conference, which undoubtedly one of the most relevant debate forum on women's autonomy and rights in Latin America and the Caribbean. Also, on behalf of the UN system, I would like to greet the member states that support the holding of this conference, and most especially, we sometimes forget those who dedicate tremendous effort to implement the recommendations between one meeting and another. In particular, my thanks to Uruguay, represented here by the director of the National Women's Institute of that country, Mariana Mazzotti, and who's held the chair of the presiding officers of the conference since 2016. And also recognition to our host country, Chile, that as of this event takes on the chair, represented here by the Minister of Women and Gender Equity, Isabel Pla, and the Undersecretary for Foreign Affairs, Carolina Valdivia. I must say that being from Uruguay and with more than 3 years service in Chile, believe me, I feel twice as committed to this conference and the commitments taken on here. I would also like to thank civil society organizations for being here, academic institutions, guilds, and public sector and private sector association, means of communication, leaders, community members, activists whose presence give life to this meeting. I've had an opportunity to talk to many of you in recent days, over the weekend, and recent hours, and truly, every time I have such an occasion, I'm always impressed impressed by the energy with which they come, the genuine commitment to the cause, women. You are an inspiration for the work that we're beginning today. And to close these greetings, a very special greeting to Åsa Ragnar and her team at UN Women. Here we have the Regional Director of UN Women, Mariana Manuele Baeza, and many of the colleagues whom I've been very glad to see these faces that I've worked with in Mexico, Central America, so many different countries, and the commitment of these colleagues is evident. And as the resident coordinator, I would like to express something that Luis Yanez said a moment ago. The satisfaction that this now regional conference of women is done jointly between ECLAC and UN Women, and this shows how we can do more with better scope when we work together. And also my colleagues from the country team in Chile and many representatives here with regional coverage. And this is also a way of helping these efforts. Alicia began by saying that this is the 14th version of the Regional Conference on Women, and the first was held in 1977 in La Habana, Cuba. Was anyone there? Well, but 43 years have gone by. But what I'm saying is that when I calculated the years, it made me to think that with 43 years, we should already be at a time when so much effort and work should no longer be necessary for the autonomy and equality and rights of women. However, although we've not yet achieved all the expected outcomes, we must recognize that over the years we have made progress in terms of the equality and empowerment of women as never before by humanity. 43 years, and those who have got that far know, all of us who have celebrated that many birthdays, this means that we have a road already traveled, learning and experience, so that today we can speak more clearly and now be more effective in achieving our goals. In coming days, we will have an opportunity to examine in detail the progress and setbacks over these 4 decades, learn from the lessons, and set priorities for the future, remembering that very simple but powerful idea of the 2030 Agenda: leave no one behind. Taking as a pillar this idea of leaving no one behind, allow me offer 3 thoughts about what that phrase means within the context of Chile today. The first thought that I would like to share is the need to look beyond the averages. Many of the indicators that we use in our assessments are based on averages, and of course they are very useful to have a macro approach and to make comparisons. But the tensions and the crises that are occurring around the world, in Latin America and also in Chile, are a call to attention so that we may examine and act on the specificity of the conditions of each group of people and not so much the averages. There are many figures about Chile that show significant progress made in recent years. But behind these figures, a reality was hidden that appeared with much strength on October the 18th past. That inequality, the experienced by a person every day in their daily life, made invisible behind figures. Collectively, we each time have more agreement in that the inequality of our societies is at the root of social, political, economic, and environmental crises that we are experiencing today. The Chilean Socioeconomic Characterization Survey, CACEN, used in Chile to design public policy, clearly shows this in relation to each topic covered. For example, wages, mentioned so many times as a global and regional issue. Let's see in the case of Chile. We know that the wage gap continues to be relevant between men and women. It has come down. It is today at 22%. Progress has been made with programs and policies to close that gap, and we must continue making efforts towards this. But we also need to look at the inequalities among women themselves. And here the data is very revealing. Women of the first decile, that is to say, with the lowest income, earn 13 times less than women in the highest decile. A similar case is of labor share. According to the latest CACEN survey available in Chile of 2017, on average, the labor participation or share of women in Chile is 49%, with a significant progress made in recent years. Nevertheless, between the women part of the richest 10%, labor share is 72%, whereas in the poorest 10%, it is barely 26%. The causes of these gaps are multidimensional and require of coordinated and integral work in terms of education, health, transport, care, household work, and even cultural factors. A more detailed analysis allows you to design more certain and effective public policy, but for this we need support and coaching by civil society as well as the private sector. Both with different roles and functions are important change agents. My second thought has to do with the current context in Chile. I cannot but mention the victims of the violations of human rights that have occurred since the start of this crisis, and especially women, young people, and girls. The mission carried out by a technical team of the Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights, based on an invitation made by President Piñera, reported that, and here allow me to quote just a couple of lines, women were affected by all modes of violations of human rights. However, they were more exposed to sexual violence. Hence, leaving no one behind means also renewing our commitment to each one of these victims, pursuing civil and criminal responsibilities that may exist, and drive towards the necessary transformations at institutional level for this to not happen again. I would like to echo the words of our Secretary General in his recent note to President Piñera, and where the General Secretary values the commitment expressed with truth, justice, and the rule of law as expressed by the government of Chile, as well as the disposition to move ahead in the protection of the rights of all people. And of course, the Secretary General reiterates the full decision of the UN in Chile to accompany the government in the implementation of the social agenda and recommendations made in the report by the Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights. And a third and last thought, when we have only 10 years for our deadline with the 2030 Agenda, Sustainable Development, but this is what we've called the Decade of Action. The challenge now is to move towards a progressive structural change that contributes to change the gender and power structure in the social and economic structures. It is necessary to diversify the productive matrices of countries, especially of Latin America and the Caribbean, towards knowledge-intensive sectors that create good quality jobs and capacities for both men as well as women. That transformation also has a very deep political meaning. In the coming months, the Chilean citizens may decide if they do or not want a new constitution, and if so, the sort of constitutional body that they would like to do this. This is unheard of in this country. We share this hope that in this participatory process there may be gender parity and appropriate representation of indigenous group and independent people in order to build a new social agreement. There are 143 constitutions around the world that guarantee equality among men and women. Chile could soon be yet another country that takes its step and that its fundamental charter establishes a floor to foster real equality and criminalizes all forms of violation and discrimination, and that encourages the political participation of women. Taking up what I was saying at the start, it is true. It's been 43 years since the first regional conference of women, and probably all people who are here would have liked to witness more progress. But my final message is of optimism. It is thanks to the experience of these years that today we have more information to better understand problems. We have far more awareness, and that the full development of equality among men and women is not sustainable. And above all, today there are thousands of women and also thousands of men who are working and will continue to work to overcome those challenges. The presence of everyone here today is the most tangible proof of that. Thank you.
We'd like to thank Sylvia Krugh for her words, and to conclude this ceremony of inauguration, we would like to give the floor to Carolina Valdivia. Thank you very much. I would like to start by thanking ECLAC, the Executive Secretary, Alicia Bárcenas, and the whole team for all of the organization of this 14th meeting on women in Latin America and the Caribbean. I'd also take advantage of this moment to thank the Minister, Isabel Pla, who is today the president or the chair of this conference for the next 3 years. And I want to congratulate her for the efforts that she has had in helping to make the gaps smaller in our country, although these still continue. So this conference is a great opportunity to interact with the authorities of other countries of the region, international organizations, civil society, and I take this moment to say hello to all of you. And I have several colleagues, vice ministers here. And we'd also like to talk about the best practices, challenges, and cooperation that favor empowerment and the advancement of women's rights and gender equality in Latin America and the Caribbean. So I was listening very carefully to what the people who spoke before me said. They have a lot more experience than I have, as far as, especially in matters that have to do with the gender equality and women's rights. And they've just told us, or given us, a very good summary of the situation of women in Latin America and the Caribbean, and it seems that it's not that great, and so we have to continue to work on it. We share the fear and the worries that we have about the violence that is happening against women, her capacity for development, and this also has to do with her mental and physical health. Femicides continues to be alarming in this region, and the gaps that we have in the workplace and also in the politics is quite considerable. We cannot be indifferent to these matters, and unfortunately inequality and gender inequity are persistent in this region. The name of this call of this conference, the autonomy of women in changing economic situation, makes us face a reality that is a great challenge that we must face. The scenarios that have been described and we'll be talking about in the next few days in this conference are real, and there are things that we're worried about nowadays: vulnerability of the economic cycles, migratory flows, digital revolution, climate change, change in demographics, and all of the factors that make discrimination very difficult to overcome, and they affect women and girls more than anyone else. The report on the Sustainable Development Goals for 2019 that was made by the United Nations recognizes that quite a bit of advancement has been made for development. Girls and women are most unfavorable, and we must face the worst types of discrimination for gender as well as other forms of exclusion. At a world level, 330 million women live in poverty, meaning with income that is less than $1.90 per day, which is 4.4 million more than men, according to the report that was published in 2018 on Gender Equality Agenda 2030 by UN Women. The changing economic scenarios also have important challenges if we don't want these gaps to remain or increase. But we must think also about the opportunities that we have, opportunities for women in Latin America and the Caribbean. In the next few days, we'll be talking about this context and its effects, and we'd like to hear about the best practices of how to face these challenges proactively, making a difference and highlighting women as agents for change. In line with what Minister Pla just said, Chile has incorporated chapters of gender in the negotiations of trade agreements in the second and third generation. It is a concrete way to include gender within this, as well as cooperation and trade for goods and services, which is very important for the well-being of our peoples. In the environment, it's important to mention that in the 25th conference in COP25 for climate change, we approved a new version of an action plan for gender and climate change, and this reinforces the plan that was made in Lima to mitigate climate changes. Speaking of the digital revolution, is an opportunity to train women and girls, and we are promoting incorporating women in areas of science, technology, and mathematics. We must train our new generations, notwithstanding their gender. Chile is one of the countries of the world where the prejudice with regards to the roles of men and women has gone down quite a bit compared to other countries, referring to politics, sexual rights, and domestic violence, according to the Global Reports of Human Development 2019 that was made by the United Nations Programme for Development. Nevertheless, we have in our country a GDP per capita gap that continues in 2018 with $29,000 for men and only $2,000 for women. I would like to give you some food for thought on this matter. The report that I've just mentioned shows us that girls and women are still the object of negative practices that affect their lives, and they continue to have to do most of the unpaid domestic work as well as taking care of other people. We must make sure that these practices, such as genital feminine mutilation, which affects more than 200 million women, and other type of cruel and humiliating treatments be eradicated. This report also shows us how in these most diverse areas, women are denied the power of decision. As a lawyer, I have seen these results from this study because we see that women's rights are not being protected. In order to face these spaces or these gaps and to guarantee the application of the law and standards for gender equality, it's important to guarantee the institutionality and that the proper mechanisms are in place to be able to do this. Among the several sectors of society, and we have seen that we can replicate the concrete results that we've seen from other places to be able to improve. Chile cooperates with the implementation of the Agenda 2030 to be able to achieve the objectives, and always very careful of including gender within everything. Otherwise, without women, we'll not be able to have sustainable development. We must continue to move forward in all of these matters, including political participation and representation, and having access to political spheres as well as environmental, financial, that have traditionally been for men. We have worked very hard so that the rights and gender equality will be able to be improved moving forwards and never backwards. This process has been launched thanks to the effort of many women who regionally and nationally are working for their rights. Women have the ability to multiply the benefits of the development of their family and their social network. This effect is even more powerful when women are able to be in a place of leadership with decision with the power to make decisions. The presence of women in international organization has been very important to be able to give strength to the matters that affect women. And today, we support the United Nations Action Plan for the Empowerment of Women and Gender Equity within the organization that is taking place within the General Secretariat. The Resolution 1325 of the Security Council of Women, Peace and Safety from the year 2000 reflects the importance of women as agents of peace. With regards to Chile, in this respect, Chile is committed, as well as many other countries of this region, to implement these objectives in national plans. With regards to the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, we have the commitment to reinforce gender equality in our foreign policies. And I'll be talking with Marta Delgado to see how they did it in Mexico. We also want to launch the presence of women and place them in decision-making positions, especially in international organizations. Therefore, and consequently, we are promoting the candidature of a woman for the first time so that she can become part of the International Tribunal of the Right to the Sea, the ambassador Maria Teresa Infante. Apart from being recognized as a jurist, an academic, a diplomat, and a national agent, we also believe that she's an excellent representative of women because she has a lot of knowledge and a lot of experience in the international arena, and that she personally has promoted and incorporated women within these matters. As we have mentioned, we believe in including chapters of gender when we negotiate with other countries, and I'd like to highlight this should also happen in the modernization in the association with the European Union that we are modernizing now to make sure that women will always have an important role and become more independent. We want to strengthen the efforts that Chile is making in this area. Chile is leading development of the roadmap to empower women in the Alliance of the Pacific 2020-2030. This is something that had never happened before within the Alliance of the Pacific. And the objective will be to identify matters and actions and goals to be able to help women move forward from an economic standpoint in this region. We participate in the technical gender group to be able to promote the participation of women in these areas, where we work actively on the virtual platform, which is called Entrepreneurial Women of the Pacific Alliance. Throughout 2019 and the current year, Chile is leading the development of an instrument or a document for self-evaluation to be able to monitor these matters focused on gender and the work plans and activities that have been carried out by technical groups of the Pacific Alliance. In APEC, we defined very clearly that it was women, small and medium enterprises, and inclusive growth. This was one of the central matters that we talked about of APEC 2013. This was a recognition of the importance that it is to make women more visible as well as the SMEs. Within this context, we approved the roadmap of La Serena on women and inclusive growth within the framework of the Week for Women. And this is a recognition. This recognizes how important it is to empower and make women much more visible and how this helps improve economic growth. On the other hand, Chile, New Zealand, and Singapore created the Digital Economic Association Agreement to be able to have basic rules to promote this platform and to help women to be able to become more digitally savvy. Throughout discussions and treaties of free trade agreements, we are aware that education and culture are of key importance, and we are sure that by implementing these chapters of gender in trade agreements, we are helping gender equality. Another means that we have in Chile to try to incorporate women into international trade is a program called Women Export, so that these companies will be able to promote exports and promoting gender equality. And in this sense, we have given support to more than 1,700 entrepreneurial women. Lastly, I would like to thank the delegates of this region for being here in Chile and the representatives of civil society due to all of their commitments and perseverance to foster the rights and empowerment of women and girls in this continent. And I wish you all a fruitious and wonderful conference. Let us not forget all of the decades of work that many women have done to be able to make women more empowered and that their rights be more equal. We hope that the spirit that gathers here today will be projected in the next session on the Commission for Society and Women that will take place from the 9th to the 20th of March in 2020 in New York, renewing the commitment acquired 25 years in the conference that took place in Beijing. We must commit our actions towards that direction, accelerate its advancements, and keeping the just demand for gender, fostering it and keeping it alive more than ever. Thank you very much.
Muchas gracias, embajadora. De este modo vamos a...
Thank you. And in this way, we will be closing this session and continue straight away with the adoption of the agenda and election of officers. I must say that this morning, the heads of delegations of the countries that are part of the conference decided to accompany Chile, or the following delegations will be accompanying Chile in the chair: Antigua and Barbuda, Argentina, Bolivia, Brazil, Costa Rica, Cuba, El Salvador, Grenada, Haiti, Jamaica, Mexico, Paraguay, Peru, Dominican Republic, St. Vincent and the Grenadines, Suriname, Uruguay. In this way, if you agree, this would be the presiding officers of the 14th Conference of Women. And so here is your title, and we will proceed to adopt the agenda. Very well, thank you, Luis. So, delegates, you have before you the document on the provisional agenda that I would like to put to you for consideration. If there are no comments, that is approved, the provisional agenda. And so now we would move on to the next document on the text, the autonomy of women in changing economic scenarios. Now, Mary Dean Gassman, the president of the Institute for Women in Mexico, and Maria Noel Baeza to come forward. And we will start the session in another few minutes. Thank you.
Por favor, vamos a retomar las tareas de la conferencia.
Please, we are about to resume the work of the conference. Please be seated and shut the door. Very well, we're going to begin the presentation of this document. Yes, thank you, Chair. Yes, very well. And now we will be presenting the report prepared by the ECLAC Secretariat, the Autonomy of Women in Changing Economic Scenarios, a presentation by Alicia Bárcena, Executive Secretary of ECLAC. And at the end of this presentation, we will hear comments by Epsi Campbell, who is the VP of Costa Rica, and from Nadine Guzman from Mexico, Maria Noel Baeza from UN Women, and others that I will be making as the Minister of Women and Gender Equity in Chile. And I'd like to hand over to Alicia Bárcena. Thank you. I will be presenting the document that we've called Women's Autonomy in Changing Economic Scenarios, and that was prepared by the Gender Affairs Division of ECLAC, directed by Mario Castillo, who is here, and the entire team of the Gender Affairs Division. It's not easy to do justice to a document that was drafted with so much care and dedication by a team of work, very sound, that has done a very in-depth research of these topics. And I believe that it is up to me to do justice to this great document prepared by my colleagues. But first of all, I would like to greet people who are with us during the inauguration: Maria Fernanda Espinosa, Alejandra Mora Mora from OAS, Rebecca Greenspan, and IDEA, OISIS, and OECD, IO, Pan America, ZASICA, and a special greeting also, very especially for Juan Samavia, who is always with us on these occasions. I'd like to begin then by telling you why this document is how it is framed. Where do we stand today? Today we're seeing global disruptions, interrelated crises, and an urgency need for a new development model. That is true. Globalization is not legitimate, neither politically nor economically, and deregulated capitalism, financialization, the market forces, free to themselves, underscore even the basis of its own reproduction. And we are seeing very poor results in economic terms and tremendous austerity that is being seriously aggravating national issues, because almost all countries are undergoing tremendous fiscal adjustments, for example, and very important setbacks and cutbacks to their budgets. The geopolitical, commercial, and technological reality between China and USA that has the entire world on edge, although recently a small agreement was reached, but the truth is that we're all living the tremendous tension between these two giants. There's a great weakness, multilateralism, and where we, the countries, developing countries and small economies, are losing out. And of course, necessary migration due to poverty, violence, and environmental crisis, with tremendous inequality. That is what we've seen. Not only Latin America, of course, and the Caribbean, as Mariela said, is the most unequal region in the world after Sub-Saharan Africa. But the developed world is also facing increasing inequality, and this is eroding social contracts and citizen confidence, and of course, the destruction of the environment. And why are we speaking of this great rupture? Because we have the 2030 agenda that should be an agenda for cooperation, for civilization, but basically that's what it is. However, international cooperation declines the more we need it, and that is the tremendous paradox that we are immersed in. And I think that the backdrop to our region are two factors: the culture of privilege and inequality. This disenchantment in the region is at a turning point. It is not just one or two countries. There are many countries in the region where this disenchantment is truly confronting the development model, a model associated to 3 decades of wealth concentration and environmental degradation, with insufficient growth and institutions that are reproducing the behavior of agents with the greatest economic and political power, and with this profit-seeking culture with privileged access to resources and finances. And this culture of privilege, yesterday we analyzed this with EPSI at this major event held on women, really organized by UN Women, and that we took part in, and for Afro-descendant women, and where we see that there is an inheritance of colonial vestiges that is hierarchical and that perpetuates this inequality. It's seen as natural, but no, it is not natural, but it does naturalize a tremendous concentration of progress and productive assets. So this culture that denaturalizes equalities, we need to change it. And not with the assistance-based approach, but empowerment. And so we, in this document, we are addressing 4 key issues. Of course, we're touching, as always, the issues that we're seeing, the structural pillars, but 4 main aspects: economic and financial globalization, digital revolution, demographic change, and climate change, to see how these 4 pillars are affecting women. And so we in the document are seeing the structural barriers. This was seen in Montevideo. There are 4 main ones that prevent us from progressing. Of course, economic inequality, socioeconomic inequality, persistent poverty, patriarchal, discriminatory, and violent cultural patterns, unfair sexual division of labor, and unjust social organization of care, concentration of power, and hierarchical relations in the public sphere. And I would say public as well as private spheres. And the 4 barriers that we have selected: finance, digital revolution, demographic change, and climate change. Those are the pillars, sorry. So, the structural barriers. Let me see now matters that the document does not address in depth, but yes, nevertheless does recognize as a problem. One issue is that those countries with lowest levels of poverty, such as Uruguay, for example, or Chile, or Panama, Costa Rica, and so on, that have made very important progress in reducing poverty, but the index of femininity has not come down. So the other countries that have reduced poverty most, but where poverty has the face of a woman. And I would say that this truly contradicts. It is insufficient to reduce poverty. We do not do it clearly in terms of gender. And of course, the culture of privilege, which naturalizes multiple types of discrimination and inequality. If we at ECLAC have made a tremendous effort to break down data between men and women to see where the issues, and also between Afro-descendant men and women and indigenous men and women. And please take a look. For example, with one same level of education, the working population, aged 15 and over, with the same level of schooling, have these tremendous wage differences. White men, non-indigenous, have a wage in US dollars where they have 22.8 income per hour, dollars per hour. Afro-descendant men, 18.1, indigenous and non-Afro-descendant women, 15.8. Afro-descendant women have a higher wage than the case of indigenous men and women because they are right at the bottom in terms of wages. And if we see this, especially based on years of schooling, when the differences shoots off is as of the age of 12 years of schooling, when we see that the years of schooling are insufficient for women and Afro-descendant and indigenous men and women. And of course, the unfair social organization of care that has a greater impact on women and is growing among lower income households. We said this, but the interesting thing would be to see the figures for you to see how the wealthiest quintile in all countries, here we have Costa Rica, Colombia, Brazil, Paraguay, Mexico, and El Salvador.
And we can see how actually non-paid work of the populations of people who are 15 years age of or more, according to the quintiles and gender, we see there is a proportion of growth when we go up in the quintile from the richest quintile to the poorest one. We can see how non-paid work of women, which is the blue bar or the purple one, that's the one that shows us that it's women. And you can observe, you can see men. It doesn't change that much, really. For men, I would say, they also have unpaid work, but, there's not such a great change, really. Very well. The document is deep, and I hope you have time to read it and see it. But now I'd like to talk about other matters, the matters that are more important for us in this document, such as the challenges for economy of women and society as a whole. First of all, we've seen that it's very difficult, and that it's very difficult in three aspects in our region, such as all of the low growth in the world economy, and especially in our region. Last year, we closed with 0.1% of growth, and we might get to 1.3, which is not much. And trade is much less dynamic. Think about it. Exports went down 4 points, and imports went down 3 points. So our trade has contracted, generally speaking, and synchronized. From the 20 countries of Latin America, 18 decelerated or slowed down. And if we think of all of the countries of the Caribbean, we're talking about practically 28 economies that slow down in a synchronized way in countries and sectors. So there is a stagnation of the reduction of the economy from 2014. And we saw there was a great effort to move forward between 2012 2014. But after that, the levels of poverty went up again and inequality again, even though it has been reduced at a slower pace, but it continues. And then working conditions have totally been deteriorated and gone down. So what are the transmission channels? Because when we say, well, yes, the global economic and financial tensions are there, but how do they impact us? They impact us in three main areas: trade, financial systems, and tax systems. And it also affects, especially, because you see, these costs and benefits are not distributed in an equal way, so they affect the workers, the consumers, the business people, and those who are responsible for unpaid care work. And we in the region have a problem that we have not been able to solve, and I said it before, which is this factory of inequality. And we're talking about the factory of inequality for two reasons. First of all, in South America, there's a prevalence of the export type of pattern, which is intensive in natural resources, which creates very little employment and much less employment for women than for men. And in Central America, we have manufacturing for exports, which generates more employment for women, actually, but mostly in low-tech sectors with large gender wage gaps. You can see how in Central America, we do have a participation of 14.5% of women, but you can see right here, it's really what we see is prevalent is the sector that we're here Sorry, please move a little bit so I can point. But we can see this is a very low technology sector, and it's really where we see that most women work. That's the point. And then here, the same thing. So we continue to have a greater prevalence of women in low technology. And generally speaking, the participation of women in the labor force is much lower in South America and Latin America than in Central America. But still, this is what we have to solve. This factor of inequality where more women will be able to enter into the sectors of high technology and medium technology, and that there should be a greater participation of salaries and also greater technology. Now, within this global context of increased financial market expansion, we have made an important analysis, and I hope you all to look at it, because in reality, it's a financial inclusion. So how much do women participate in the financial world and formal financial activities to have an account in a financial institution? Look, in any case, it's actually very low in Latin America because men have an access of 56%, women of 50%. So it's not that men are a lot better. They're both badly off, but women are worse off. Who saves the most, or who participates in the systems for saving? Not only save more, but in the systems of saving, who is linked formally to a financial institution? Well, 15% men, 9.3 women. And within the whole matter of loans, we can see that men generate more loans, 23.9, and I say this again, it's not very much, but 80% are women. Nevertheless, when we talk about what happens in financial inclusion with regards to the fact that once we go to the bank, once women get to the bank, for every 100 units that men are given, women in Guatemala get 59%. In Chile, 57%, and in Costa Rica, a little bit more, it's 67%. There are many more barriers for women than for men when we have access to credit from the banking institutions. Why? Because there are very high costs, and the criteria to measure the risk and establish if someone is eligible is much more strict in women. It's much harsher. Women are overrepresented. Women of lower incomes are overrepresented. Strategies have been focused on microcredits, but that's not enough. It's true. We have to have the same capacity we need to have the same capacity to enter into the financial market, and other types of technologies such as fintech are giving women more opportunities, and because of this we think that fintech can be an interesting option. And then of course the development bank, we need the development bank. I'm glad that they're here accompanying us here. Thank you for being here, because it's been one of the most open banks, open to have this type of lines of credit and products and services that are specific based on gender. And the CAF has many very good practices in this sense. The culture of privilege, and I'm going quite quickly because time is of the essence and I don't want to be hung, drawn and quartered. But in the document, I would ask you to read this document later. The culture of privilege is reflected in the tax systems. So what do we mean by this culture of privilege? Well, tax evasion, basically. Tax evasion in Latin America is 6.3% of the GDP, $340 billion a year. That is the amount of tax evasion. So what is 6.3 GDP? It's 150% of the expenditure for social protection. So if we were able to get this 6.3% of tax evasion and put it only to social protection, 150%. So it's urgent to put an end to this. In order to have more fiscal space, it tells we can't have fiscal reforms, but here we have a source of resources. Tax expenses, that is, this is what the states stop receiving, this on purpose to give privileges to companies, their friends, and who knows what, and that is called tax renouncement. And in Latin America, it's 3.7%. tax spending. And some are justified, like reducing the value-added tax. For example, in Mexico, books don't pay value-added tax very well. Or there's the price of medicines and some foods go down. But really, women, authorities, we need to get into these matters harshly. Be able to sit down with the Minister of Finance and say, dear colleague, and I have an ex-Minister of Finance right here, Alberto, aren't you there? We need to have the data in our hands to be able to talk about these. They say there's no money for my gender entity because of blah, blah, blah. I can tell you where you can get the money, where we can find some resources, right? And we're going to help you get them. What do you think of that? And then the other thing is that we need progressive policies, progressive tax policies that consider the structure of the home. And some countries do this. Ecuador, in Guatemala, they use this criteria that bear in mind the structure of the home and the care to be able to analyze how much tax they should pay. And I think that is very important. They're very careful about the household structure, and they use that as a criteria of how much can be paid. In Cuba as well, there's also a special bond for those people who work, they're self-employed. And we have our delegate here who knows that this policy is very important, because this means that the homes have a fiscal space that's a bit bigger. And generally speaking, we have to achieve these exonerations, tax exonerations, for products that are of utmost importance, such as medicine and certain foods. I mean, we should all move towards this. Mexico's done this. Mexico has tax exoneration for books as well as medicines and other things. I love the thing about the books. Now, also to be able to promote women joining the workforce, we also have to broaden this. We have a tax rate of about 18% thanks to Brazil and Argentina, because they have the highest rates. But beyond that, we're all doing very badly. But we have 13 points difference with the OECD. So we we aspire to be members of the OECD. I think that's all very well. But we have to have these indicators, and they have to be up and running properly. And that those who make more should pay more. The richest 10% of our region has to pay more. It can't be any other way. If I tell you the 10% of the poorest people compared to the 10% of people who are the poorest, it's 70 times the difference. 70 times the difference. And we saw an example here. The 10% of the poorest women, 10% of the richest women, and the difference in income is 13 times. And that's not possible. We have to be responsible to be able to tax those who have the most. So we have to do something very important, which is to incorporate in these trade agreements these matters of gender. In the document, we talk about what Chile has done with the free trade agreements and incorporated. Well, Chile and Uruguay actually have a free trade agreement. I think it was the first one that included the whole matter of gender. That was very important. And from there, we got other agendas that Chile did, and with the same dynamics. It's very important to include gender in trade agreements, to be able to have a favorable, differentiated treaty for women. It's necessary. A treatment for women is very important to reduce asymmetries of the small and medium-sized companies, both exports, where women have an important role, entrepreneurs, and of course, to be able to close this gap in the use of financial systems and services, the use of financial services. And I propose to you that we should move forward and have agreements with the bank superintendencies and the banking industries of every country so that we can make a study of financial inclusion. We have methods. We can do it in all countries. I think it's important so that we will know how much is the financial inclusion of women and men in each and every one of your countries and how we can improve. And of course, tax evasion is very important, and illegal financial flows, which are not necessarily drugs. I mean, I wouldn't be here talking about it, but what I'm talking about right now is that illegal financial flows are what we consider like the the under invoicing for exports and then putting the bill up later and lowering it so it looks different and that if you're charging a smaller price, and that can be resolved. This happens a lot on the borders. We can go there and see what's happening. Investing in matters for care, I've said this before, but we have to put a cost to the matter, and that's what we're trying to do. How much of the public budget should be destined to the care systems? We must invest in them. For example, the PTCs are conditional transferences. These programs of transfiscal conferences cost approximately 0.33% of GDP. Do you remember the figure that we talked about tax evasion? This is 0.3. And all of these little programs of families in action, all the things that we do of conditional transferences is 0.3. So the programs for labor inclusion that some countries have, such as Costa Rica, Uruguay, Mexico, Chile, cost 0.45% of the GDP. Now that would add up to 0.7, and we're still on 0.3. So how much should we give or should we invest in the care system? When we think about labor inclusion as 0.4 and the other one is 0.7, we should put a cost on it. We don't know what the cost is, but we should give it a cost so that it will be incorporated into the national budgets. Otherwise, we will meet up again in 3 years' time and we'll continue to talk about the fact that we don't have a system of care that is financed by the government. Digital revolution. What's happening with the digital revolution is so important. And first of all, I'd like to thank Mario Castillo because this is his area of expertise. Digital revolution, that is. And he has introduced this matter in the whole matters of gender. We've even used big data to measure what this document is showing us. And we're looking to see what is the cost of automation. What will the cost be? What is the society of information? What will happen with platform companies? I'm sure those that women back up, such as the case of transportation in some cases, education, and what happens with gender violence in the networks. That's very important. We see that automation will bring changes that are very important in the organization of paid work. It will affect routine types of tasks. Think about it. It's going to affect, and we can see it very clearly, this distribution of the population that is employed and type of income and gender and sex and whatever. Non-qualified employees, a majority, those who work in services, those are going to be the ones that are going to suffer the most because of this automation. Intellectuals and professionals a bit less, office professionals, goodbye, and so on. So the document is showing us the areas that are going to be highly vulnerable to become automated. Look, the economy of care is not subject to automation. So well-organized, this economy of care with proper technology and training is one of those sectors that can create employment. So here, as I was saying, the document has many more details for you to peruse later, but here we see the gap between men and women for hour of work, whether they're qualified or not qualified, the services, and you see the gap continues to be very high, 11%, 12%, 16%. Similar work. We're talking about similar work with similar qualifications. There's still an important gap of income. And when we look at what is happening in science, technology, engineering, mathematics, in order to see what's happening and what happens if women are we in this type of career or not, and we see that in careers that have to do with technology, engineer, mathematics, in the last year, or the last year of data we have, we see the percentages here. The proportion of women is here, 56.4 compared to 43.6. Look, this is interesting. In the Virgin Islands, British Virgin Islands, there's more women that have graduated in science and technology than men. Now, if we go to Panama, Panama also has a lot of women, 49% compared to 51 men. But generally speaking, the percentage is very low. when we're talking about low percentages in our region. The students, we just made an analysis in the social area when we analyzed. First of all, we at ECLAC do not accept the idea of middle classes. What we observe are strata, the strata, income strata. And so we talk about the poverty, extreme poverty, poverty, medium low, medium high. So in the medium strata, low, medium, and high, 55% of the people at the age of working have not studied for 12 years. They haven't completed high school or 12 years. That's 55%. And in the poorer strata of extreme poverty and poverty, 76% has not finished the 12 years of education. So it's no wonder that we have such low figures in matters of those who have gone on to tertiary education, which is what is needed to reach the higher levels of technical innovation. And these countries here, between the Virgin Islands, Panama, Uruguay, Argentina, Belize, so far up to there, women at least participate in about 40-odd%. But if we go and look at the other countries, you can see the situation is truly dramatic, because we don't have this capacity to get into these careers, to later be able to move forward and work in more sophisticated technical matters. Information is a key element to make public services more efficient, as well as transparency and equality. And we see that the use of social networks to promote gender equality is very important. The use of massive data. But the thing there is, who has this massive data? Is it Google, Apple, Amazon, etc.? So how can we make that mass data be at the service of us and society as a whole, for matters such as matters that have to do with managing risks, for example, so that we will know where people are that are being affected by an earthquake or disaster or something like that? And then, of course, the campaigns on social networks, not one less, for example, access to information, and of course, access to information that gives us opportunities to know and tax and gives us access to justice somehow as well. And what are the threats? There are threats, very strong threats. The economic power in the hands of a few global firms, as we were saying. The invasion of privacy and security breaches. There's a very dark side to this. There's a very dark side to artificial intelligence and technology. General Secretary said this in Davos last week. We talked about the important risk of the dark side of technology, especially that which will be used or is being used for military, defense, destruction, diseases, and what have you. Anonymity, massification, and the coordination between perpetrators of gender violence. We continue to see groups that are not having access to these technical matters. So we have digital elites. Those that are excluded are about 36.8%. Those who do not have any access whatsoever. And where we have the greatest amount of access on our telephones rather than on the fixed part of cable or of broadband. Violence against women. This is a great thing to see how this is reproduced in social networks. And this is one of the very dark sides of technology,
where we have vigilance or tracking and unauthorized tracking and access to information, defamation, doxing, which is truly practices research over the internet, individualized, in order to intimidate, threat, even extortion. This is what's called doxing. Discriminatory discourse, harassment, replacement of identity. And so we analyze each one of these factors and how to make decisions, especially at political level, in order to see what sort of cooperation? On the one hand, I think that there we have a very important issue, regional cooperation, because we must have regional digital markets, undoubtedly, in all countries of Central America and Mexico, in all areas of South America, the Caribbean. But above all, the major obstacle to have regional digital markets is not so much the infrastructure, but regulation and access to the spectrum. And so these are the things that could be addressed through public policy. And there would be well worthwhile having cross meetings, Manuel, with the ministers of technology and ICTs. And so we have here the ELAC conference, which is the digital conference and the Digital Information Society to be held in Santiago. When? In April, yes. So this conference will be chaired by Brazil. So it is very, very important that you may come and that we may really cross meetings, because we have service providers, the over-the-top, who are the Ubers, the Googles, and, well, they're not called over-the-tops, no, but those who have the infrastructure, many telecommunications companies with public funds, and also those who could provide the data and the information. So I think it would be well worthwhile. It is a very important meeting where they talk a lot of discussion between private sectors and the civil society and governments. And I think that we should introduce there undoubtedly the issue of gender, and above all, the use of data, transfer of knowledge to key areas, and how to prevent gender violence. We must create awareness among service providers of the issues that are created. Google globally is clear about this, but I don't know if at regional level. So this is something that we should do. And of course, include women in innovative sectors such as renewable energy and other emerging sectors from here on. The care economy, well, as we've said here on many occasions, how, in fact, the idea is to see if we could make visible the unpaid work. Because 1 of 3 women who are occupied are in care economy sectors. And those who do receive pay, yes, 11.1% of women do receive a wage. But this is paid domestic work, and there's still a lot to do to legally protect women who are working in domestic work. Important laws have been passed. Chile has one, but a lot of work must be done here to regulate and legalize the work done by women and giving them social protection. And in paid care work, 17.5 are women out of a total of 28.6. This is a distribution of the population aged 15 and over, and that is taking part for pay in care. And men as well, they lag behind. Leave no one behind should include this for them to go up and give us a hand. But because men are at 5.6. And, well, the other very important aspect here is how to appreciate, how to recognize this work, unpaid work, and how we're going to do it. How much time is dedicated to domestic work unpaid by gender and type of work. And so here we have, in yellow, we have domestic work, and in blue, this is domestic work, and their care work, which is this one here, the lilac, and the other one. So there, yes, men come down tremendously. There are places where they don't even appear, such as in Bolivia, or in Chile, very low, in Costa Rica, my dear Epsi, pretty low. And so in Mexico, Nadim, well, not even to mention it. So it's the men that need to bite into the care economy a bit more. Here we have the percentages. And of course, women are doing domestic work and also in care work very significantly. And I think that here, too, it is important to see what's the total of domestic and care work, where we see that the figures are very high. Even in Argentina, my dear minister, there we have the matter. 21% are women in domestic work and 9.3 men are doing unpaid. This is unpaid work. We must say this is unpaid work. And this is the one that's so valuable because these satellite accounts show that if we were to include this in national accounts, GDP would be very different. And the other thing addressed by the document, this is very rich documents with many topics. The issue is demography and how this is related and what's going to happen. Because what's going to happen with care in the near future? Not that very distant future, and when we will have a population change, very severe, and there will be less men, more women, and more old people. So we're going to, the population is changing, and we will have each time more people aged. There's a drop in fertility rates. This is also very clear. Teenage pregnancy. All countries are making major efforts, but it still prevails. But controlling this is going to be a very important demographic issue. And the greater presence of minors in poor homes. But this is what happens with adolescent pregnancy, that it affects the entire life cycle, because where does adolescent pregnancy occur? Among indigenous people, Afro-descendants, the poorer homes that have more children. And it's there that we have this vicious circle of poverty. And the rise in life expectancy is an issue, and the feminization of old age. And so, in fact, this is what is happening with the demographic curve. By 2020, we're here in the gray area, but by 2050, another 30 years, undoubtedly, there's going to be a very significant demographic change. And what will prevail is the older population, people over the age of 40, over the age of 45. And if we do not have the social security systems, this is going to burden the younger ones. And so here the document also accounts for what happens with a global care and this movement in domestic work. This is an example of global care chains where women migrants are covering care needs that are not addressed by national policy. So there's care work sometimes that not even the nationals want to do. And so we have migrants that come to satisfy that need. For example, 69% of Paraguayan migrants and 58% of Peruvian women are doing paid domestic work in Argentina. 13% of all female migrants are in paid domestic work in Chile. And 34% of all female migrants are in paid domestic work in Costa Rica. 3 examples. The document has many more. But this is not easy because these women who migrate to care for other families left their own families behind. And so they mothers at a distance with remittances. So there is an issue here, a social issue of another nature. Yesterday we were talking about UN Women and others about these mechanisms for the advancement of women should be involved in migration policies. We require a different sort of institutionality to address these topics. And of course, well, guidelines. It's difficult to put a fiscal cost. What would be the cost of a national care system? What are the public policies that could really recognize the contribution made by women? How to measure it in order to show national accounts, central banks, and so on, the statistics that this is already being done? Quite a lot in the region. I must recognize that most countries are already accounting time for time use. And we need to have social protection systems that respond to these demographic changes. here and there. I also recognize that Alberto Arenas has helped us a lot to do a compared study of the pension systems in the region to see where we stand and where we're headed, whether from individual capitalization we're going to the pay-as-you-go or mixed systems, what would be most advisable for each economy. But this is urgent. I think that all countries here have an important issue here related to pensions, or are about to do a reform, or have already reformed, or that at least are concerned about the topic. So this is very important that we do it, and of course, coordinate regional and sub-regional policies for migration, especially to protect women at their place of origin, in transit, in destination, and the return, which is what is most happening today in Mexico and Central America. And then lastly, the last chapter, or the last aspect analyzed in the document, is climate change and how this has an impact on the economy of women. And say, for example, the water shortages, how women must spend many hours going to fetch water from places where there isn't any water. The dry corridor in the Northern Triangle in Central America is suffering serious drought, and here in Chile there is a tremendous drought, and so the lack of water, which is affecting strategic sectors, agriculture, and so on. There's going to be water rationing at any moment, or it already exists in some countries. Tourism, here also we analyze this sector under threat, especially in the Caribbean, because this is a source of employment for many women and constantly threatened by natural disasters. And then, of course, the absence of the gender perspective in post-disaster support programs. We who assess disasters, we do the damage and loss assessment. We realize that in places where you have women, there is less damage. It's quite incredible. Women are great carers of the family, of homes, and when there's a natural disaster. However, once the disaster happens and you have the post-disaster programs, women ignore them. And it's urgent to respond to climate change and address the differentiated impacts. We're making a major effort to see what are the differentiated impacts in agriculture, energy, urban areas, forests, and biodiversity. For example, for indigenous people and Afro-descendants, we should connect EPSI. We've also talked about this yesterday as to how we should protect our biodiversity. Our biodiversity is the only thing that's going to save us from climate change. Biological diversity, cultural diversity. And if we're not able to understand diversity, we will not be able to manage. And of course, coastal areas and water resources, where there Chile has led significantly with regard to oceans, to protect not only coastal areas, but oceans from plastic. Almost all countries are trying to do away with the use of plastic once and for all. And I believe it is urgent to have conditions so that women are not excluded. And please note that there are ways of doing it, because we have the Gender and Climate Change Action Plan. 7 countries already have one. Costa Rica, when we're pre-COP, Costa Rica organized a major event, and the action plans for gender and climate change were presented. Very relevant, because that analyzes precisely the connection that is going to affect women in relation to energy, transport, water, and these are the gender action plans. And of course, equality with climate change, including other countries that are looking, Guyana, Grenada, Honduras, Paraguay, Suriname, and Uruguay. But we urgently need to make this connection between the environment and women. And another topic that ECLAC has done a lot of work on is the rights of women and men, environmental advocates. And we've done this through an instrument that is called the Escazú Agreement, that was born in Costa Rica. And that is an agreement that proposes access to information, justice, and citizen participation in relation to the environment. This is the only agreement worldwide in the world that protects the rights of environmental activists. And that's why it's so important. It's not been ratified by all countries. We're on that for it to come into effect and that we may truly have an instrument that is a citizen instrument, of course, but a political instrument of great relevance. And the Montevideo strategy, of course, that also speaks of the importance of including the gender in environmental plans and for climate change, especially the NDC's nationally determined commitments, which were taken to COP25 and to COP26 will be taken there. So we need to align policies. We think that adaptation to climate change is very important in our region, more than mitigation, because there are 8.3% of greenhouse gas emissions, but it's going to be one of the regions most affected by climate change, especially Central America and the Caribbean. And then we need to cross this and achieve participation by more women in relation to climate change. In sum, my dear colleagues, what can we put on the table? Renewing multilateralism, enhance generation equality. Mexico, France, and everyone must help go to Beijing +25 to correct the asymmetries in relation to globalization. These asymmetries, we have 8.3% emissions, and we're going to be most affected. This is a tremendous asymmetry. Where are fiscal evasion? Where are the funds going? Because the truth is you have someone who receives these funds, as a rule, developed countries, certainly, but then with a digital revolution, migration, and climate change, and we need data. Data continues to be very important. ECLAC is always at your service. We have a great team to make headway with the formation, data, and prospective studies, so that you too may have the elements to say, well, which way will we go? I want the care economy. Okay, I want equality. I want financial inclusion. I would like to cross this with labor issues. Here's the data. Here's the information. And that is what I believe we can do. And of course, rethink relations between institutions and structures with a broad range of agents, because here the idea is to change the power relations and transform privileges into rights. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I'd like to thank Alicia for your presentation. A lot of the data that you gave us is very important to bear in mind, not only this week, but also in the next few years. So I would like to invite the Vice President of Costa Rica, Epsi Campbell. You have the floor.
Buenas tardes. Muy buenas tardes. Primero quiero.
Thank you very much. I'd like to thank ECLAC, the United Nations, for this event that was carried out for more than 4 decades without interruption. And this permits us to see how what the situation of women is like, and it makes us think and be able to reach the necessary agreements to be able to achieve equality between men and women from many points of view, which is what we really aspire to have. This document shows us a situation with some levels of seriousness, or things that are quite grave, actually. I don't think that we can look down on this. And the fact that what the document is telling us is that we have moved forward much less than what we could have, because not all the necessary decisions have been taken to be able to face what is seen as a culture of privileges. It talks about certain matters that are essential, the matters that have to do with the fiscal agreements in our countries. But not only the fiscal account as such, like how much money do we need to finance development, but also who are paying and who are not paying, from their responsibilities the resources that we need for development. And I think that that is also a matter that is very, very important. We look at these new matters in the document, those that have to do with the impacts of climate change and what we have as internal challenges, but also the whole era of digitalization and the potential gaps and the real ones that we have. So we have to move forward. I think that the document also makes us think that these type of debates shouldn't happen only in the Women's Conference at ECLAC, but we should upscale this debate so that coherent decisions are taken, because right now the 50% population is at a disadvantage. So I would like to talk about some things that are not really so much as a diagnosis. I think the whole matter of the gaps is evident. The whole matter of unsustainable inequality is evident too. If we don't solve the problems through direct, frank agreements with society, well, definitely we're going to continue to witness how doors are kicked in to go into places and demand negotiations. And I think that Latin America is reaching a time where we see that political agreements of in closed rooms with the formal representations are becoming insufficient to be able to find solutions. Inequality hurts, not only in your stomach and the lack of having a house, a roof over your head. It also hurts in your soul because you feel like a human of lesser value, one that has no right because she was born with a gender identity or a racial identity, or in a place such as in the countryside or rural area if you're an indigenous person or a descendant from Africa. Because if you're poor over generations, when you have the promise of inclusion, well, it is a half-hearted promise, and those pacts are not sustainable in the long term. The first thing that I think that we would have to think about has to do with, well, according to the diagnosis that's been presented, but what do we do at a global level? Because here we're talking about some challenges of internal policies, and we cannot deny any of them. We're talking about fiscal pacts with a perspective of inclusion, which is clear, where we say not only what we want to finance, but how much each person has to give and who has to be given a concession to not pay, and in what time frame are we going to finance that development, including the economy of care. But we have to look also into health systems, quality education for all social strata, and mainly for the lower and medium size stratas, because they're receiving a more deficient type of education, which makes the gap bigger. So the whole matter of the fiscal pact, although we might say that there's not much space within the taxes, it means that we have to see how the money is going to be spent from all the money that we all give when we have direct or indirect taxes. And also, we should not tolerate evasion anymore, because whenever we're talking about matters of income from the state, then we center on what do we do to increase taxes, but we don't do very much to have a proper commitment of how we're going to overcome this problem of tax evasion. Another matter is that things of women's matters have to be in the priorities of development. I am happy that President Carlos Alvarado has said that one of the main centers of this period, this constitutional period, is to face the matters that have to do with the gaps between men and women of our country. And that's a matter that we have to give a proper result in a very short term. So I'd like to propose a global a global agreement for you. I think that if we think about the Agenda 2030 and we recognize the goals that we have for the 2030, and we continue in the rhythm that we're going at, then we don't have to wait for 2030 to know that we're not going to be able to achieve these objectives of sustainable development. It's very easy to make a projection if we continue to walk at the same speed that we're walking at now. I think that what's been said here, and by the way, Alicia, I think that we should spread out the data of the economically active population in order to incorporate an analysis for those who are above 18 years of age, because we can't continue to think that active economic activities are going to be measured from people who are 15 years of age, because that means you're betting on poverty. No country can aspire that their youth, men and women, instead of being within an educational system, are actively employed, unless we're thinking about a very primary economy. We would have to take that part of the population out within the analysis of the data to be able to see what is happening with a population between the ages of 15 and 18 that should be studying and could be working, but that shouldn't be a social aspiration that they have. Now, the global agreement, and here I'm thinking about those who are above 18 years of age, well, it's an agreement between states, international organisms, companies that want to be part of this, and women's organizations, to talk about some goals that have to do with the increase of women in an economically active population. So let's say that in order to achieve the objective number 5, well, we'd have to think that the population that is economically active of women should be about 70% in 2030. So we've got 20 average points. And of course, the average is, well, I wanted to ask ECLAC to use more, don't use the average because it makes us think. And you've said it better than anyone. Averages give us a perspective, which is usually quite wrong when we think about the reality of this region. So the agreement is so that we'll be able to establish a strategy to incorporate women in productive processes with 2 goals. The first one is the goal of 2025, where we should have increased the participation of women by 10%, which means that we would have more or less about 60%, more or less. 10% also means that some countries that are a bit lower have not actually reached the 60. But it has to be a strategy that we do together. I say the companies that want to be part of this because we'd have to incorporate the private sector, so that directly we'll be able to assume voluntarily goals of incorporation of women in the most dynamic sectors of the economy. I say the most dynamic ones because we don't want to continue with the whole logic of precarization of employment, and especially not women's employment. And I also think that private companies, because there will be a part that we need from the strategy of CREAR that goes through private companies. It doesn't only go through the states. It goes through new agreements, and it's an agreement that has to do with taxes as well. So it's not only the companies or people of higher resources have to pay proportionally more money, but also in some other services, because otherwise it's unthinkable that we'll be able to have the opportunities of care that women need when they incorporate or they go into the working market. So between 2025 and 2030, we should increase 10% of what's been achieved in 2025. And we'd have to establish in this global agreement for the incorporation of women in productive processes a whole series of goals and mechanisms that will really permit us to measure how we move the needle in this sense and move it in the right way. We have to do something that will measure it, and we can't just wait to see when is the next survey of the homes or the next gathering of information. that will tell us that we still haven't done enough. And I think that there are some alliances and some companies that already have a policy of incorporation for women, and I think that these are the first. They can be the allies or an effect or an example for others, because what we do have is some data that talks about the incorporation of women in companies also increases the profit. Therefore, it's good for business. It's good for business to have women in these companies. In the space where decisions are taken in these companies, and by doing that, productivity goes up. We know this because the projections for growth for the GDP of our countries, if we incorporated women as equals, the increase of GDP of our countries could move between 50 and even 30% in some cases. So it's quite valid that we can have these negotiations with the companies, and I think that ECLAC, with this data, could be a facilitator. The second thing is that, in fact, this document establishes specific realities with regards to having access to banking products, credit, and these matters. Women are going to be employed in the private sector, basically. They're going to be employed in companies that their own companies or small companies, not so much micro companies, because I think the data that we have of the death of the micro and small companies in our country is quite dramatic. In 5 years, 95% of micro companies have died, and the same people, often the women themselves, try another initiative to be able to generate some kind of income. Now, I also think that we would require, with the financial system, the national one and the international one, it's more and more international, we need some kind of agreements that have to do with access to credit, which once again is good for business because it's good pay. And I also think that that requires what I have called affirmative action to break the obstacles, the structural obstacles that exist in the financial system. I think that this can be done in some countries. The trials, some countries can commit to come to some agreement with the financial system, the national financial system, with the nationalized banking, if it exists. In my country, it does exist. We have a state bank and we have a national system of banking, which, by the way, doesn't really have a lot of women in it. So we need to have like a percentage that the resources should reach women, not only to give support to the initiatives, but also to accompany these initiatives to finance good business, and not just the business that women identify out of need, and that we'll be able to change, and that the photograph of the financial system to work on the indebtment. I think this is very clear. We talked about indebtment, and often that debt is theoretically for consumption, but women have used it to get into debt to cover their small businesses. And then with the usury rates of interest, it's impossible for them to survive. Now, the third thing has to do with a much clearer strategy, or regional actions that are much clearer from the regional perspective as far as climate change is concerned, and the impacts of what is happening on these communities that are actually paying for this bill. We don't all pay it the same. And so it's necessary for us to have something that already exists, but we should have it at hand. And what we need is that map, the map of those countries or cities or places of our own region that are being impacted the greatest by climate change. And here we can identify what are the measures that we've had to comply with this slowly but surely, thinking that 2030 was not a promise, it was a commitment to achieve the Sustainable Development Goals.
Costa Rica drafted, and I believe that this is an experience that we would like to share, drafted the National Plan for Decarbonization. And this plan obliges us to walk along a certain path to really respond to climate change, knowing what Alicia has said, ECLAC has said, and the world has said, that we're not the ones who have the emissions, but our part is to suffer it, because otherwise we will, although our contribution is small, the impact will be even greater. The COPs will continue to be the space for negotiating themes related to climate change and the responsibility of the wealthier countries to take on their responsibilities. But I think that at country level, women should promote national plans for decarbonization. Women's offices should be places to promote topics related to development for the whole of society, because this results in new compacts. I say, we should not only do what it says here and what the institutes and the Ministry for Women have done, but also we need to work with the fiscal compacts, the national decarbonization plans, agreements to include women in productive processes, and so on. Change that view. So I would like to end by saying that in terms of care economy, states have major challenges and few funds. So the challenges are great. And that is why we need to see, well, how can we resolve the demand in terms of care with few resources, public resources, a few more private resources, and collective responsibility, a clearer one. To not burden the shoulders of women. Of course, this is a new negotiation, social negotiation, within families. Women, as we've seen, fertility rates in the report itself are down in countries such as ours. Demographic bonuses depend a lot on migrants, migration that we are receiving. And so migration should be seen not only as a cost, but also an opportunity. The demographic bonus in Costa Rica in 2030, 2040, and 2050 depends a lot on the migration from Nicaragua as a result of the economics in Nicaragua and the political situation there. The situation there means that we have migration, and that we must see it not so much as a problem, but how to include in our strategies this very relevant amount of migrant labor that becomes labor that contributes to the economic development of our country quite significantly, and of course for the people who've migrated. We need to discuss this in a different way, because we continue to see migration equal a problem, migration equal to a demand on the state. But the migration also means a contribution, and in future this will multiply. People we know are going to migrate constantly, looking for new opportunities. And if opportunities don't arise in one country, they will look at another and another. And this is logical, because if investment move about so easily among countries, why shouldn't people move about looking for those opportunities? And so I know that migration should be reassessed. And also, there's a series of issues posed that imply partnerships between international agencies, women's organizations, and the states. Everything that has to do with universal access to sexual and reproductive health and the reproductive rights of women and good quality health services, the challenges of violence against women and girls, especially girl and adolescent pregnancy. I think that we should have this goal of girl and adolescent pregnancy zero. This cannot be any other way. It cannot be that in a region we have girls of 11 and 12 years pregnant. That is a tremendous violation of all types of rights. And we don't really talk about it that much because it is so strong that we would like to leave it shut away in a cupboard. But the rise in pregnancies, in some cases, among Afro-descendants, including in my own country. And this means that we need to address this from a multicultural and pluri-ethnic viewpoint. And so, this is a moment when, if we make decisions today, it will be possible to leap forward qualitatively in the future. I believe that this RCW is putting on the table the crucial issues that affect democracy, that affect economic development and inequality for society in general, not just for women, and that we are finding each time more and more actors who are prepared to join in this strategy. My view of the future is very positive. I believe that we are seeing a generational transformation. Younger people or younger women decided not to keep their mouths shut nor with their arms crossed, but or just doing digital activism. No, today they're in the streets demanding their rights. They're prepared to negotiate new social compacts and they're looking for proposals that affect not only them directly. So, because young people each day understand that there's a nation that depends on them today. What they do today is going to affect the society in future. And it doesn't just depend on those of us who are in power today. And I think that we must make the most of that to meet our SDGs. Times ahead could be extraordinary if we are able to establish partnerships with the civil society, understand that we're governing for the world, and have partnerships with enterprises, because it's in society that they're attempting to generate wealth. We need to talk among men and women. And so I believe that this document poses challenges. We need strategies, and those strategies for the next 3 years at the offices of women and at ECLAC, many of us are prepared to do what's necessary so that by 2030, no woman, no girl be left behind. Be this girl indigenous, Afro-descendant, living in rural areas, and that everyone may not just have a promise of equality and non-discrimination in the Constitution, but that this be ensured for them in their actual life. Thank you. Well, I thank the Vice President of Costa Rica, Epsi Campbell, for her remarks on the document on women's autonomy and changing economic scenarios presented by Alicia Bárcena. And now I will recognize Nadine Gassman, who is president of InMujeres of Mexico. Thank you, and it is a privilege to be here together with such important actors and with proposals for the present and the future. I'd like to begin by thanking ECLAC for this extraordinary document that, of course, will guide us in coming years with regard to national as well as regional policy. And it is for me a privilege to be here together with Epsie Campbell, who has set the bar high, Minister Isabel Pla, and especially Alicia Bárcena and her team. And so it is a challenge to comment on a document presented as an X-ray, an almost full X-ray of the situation of women in Latin America and the Caribbean. I would really like to thank ECLAC because every page is a manifesto on the reality of women in the region. And the reason why I see this as an X-ray is because it allows us to identify where do women in Latin America and the Caribbean stand today. What do they use their time? What are the difficulties they face every day? What are the possible causes? How to measure these issues in a much broader context, in socio-political, economic, and labor and technology terms, and also in relation to the environment. And lastly, what can we do to turn around the situation of inequality that they are living in? Nevertheless, for me, the best of this X-ray is its positive diagnosis, saying that we are still in time to slow the possible consequences if things remain as they are today, and gives us clues on how to do this. What is the document saying? I would like to quickly cover 6 points that I believe are conclusive. The first, that we have moved ahead, but not sufficiently. Member states must go from the regulations and institutional design to actually implement the legislation already adopted, and also access to justice for women. Second, we need to strengthen the autonomy of women in the region. And considering the physical, economic autonomy, decision-making, the situation of most women continues to be of great subordination to men colleagues, and very vulnerable in the economic, social, and climate change context that humanity faces. The text is ample in showing figures of the lag regarding the women's economy. And I would like to focus on one figure that I found was of great concern. Although the percentage of women of their own income has come down from 41% in 2002 to 28% in 2017, this figure is much higher than the bare 13% of men in the same condition. Third, all women's life cycles are marked by inequality. There is an intersectional way of addressing this will help us. Since childhood to aging, we face structural discrimination that is an obstacle to achieving the sustainable development that we have committed to with the 2030 Agenda. I quote the document, "Gender inequalities for women endure for life." Point 4. The work of women sustains the world but continues to be paid, unpaid, and unrecognized. Women have worked since the beginning of time, and it is precisely the invisibility of this work of a domestic nature, of care, that's allowed the economic development as we know it. Nevertheless, this task is still unrecognized and not appreciated financially. The document warns that this will change with the end of the young society in the region. By 2023, the largest group will age, especially by 2050. There are new challenges on the way, and new skills will be necessary to address that stage. 5. The labor market of the future may benefit or condemn the life of women. The word that best describes labor future is transformation and uncertainty. We cannot shut our eyes to the fact that technology, robotization, and automation will radically transform the labor world. And in view of this, on the one hand, we have this issue that human capital that is trained in this, as we have seen, is far greater among men than women, and is representing the decision makers. That is, once again, we were letting the male approach to shape the labor world of the future if we do not take action today for this transformation to become an opportunity. However, on the other hand, occupations linked to care it's not likely that they may be automated. So here we have a tremendous female participation. We have skills related to empathy, emotional support, companionship that are not going to be substituted by technology, at least in the short term. So we must increase the participation by women in IT and make sure that they may reach decision-making positions. We need women's participation in automation. I was going to share a story, but, well, I think there's no time. 6, climate change, as has been said, in turn needs a change based on gender equality. The document clearly explains how women, all the more so vulnerable women, such as indigenous women, Afro-American women, women with disability, suffer the consequences of climate change, restricting their access to water, mobility, work, and making recovery in case of a disaster even more difficult. Our challenge is to change the economic system that disproportionately continues to use limited natural resources and, more urgently, respond to migrations of families seeking better conditions. Now, today I'm here to imagine new beginnings. When I read about the situation of women and the place that they hold in society, always lagging behind, always in the last few places, the last instances, minor percentages in education, health, pensions, science, mathematics, and along, etc., it is clear to me that what we need, as the Vice President was saying, we need a new social compact. If we think that this world as we know it was designed mainly with a male approach, this means that women are suffering the consequences of the decisions made in a system where we're not even being allowed to be part of. This is a double injustice. On the one hand, for being excluded from the model, and on the other hand, being the main hit by catastrophes. Women need to be refreshed, economic, socially, politically, environmentally, in order to take a leap. This document shows that when women are involved in decision-making positions, there are new guidelines for the distribution of wealth. There are new approaches, and other traditionally excluded groups are benefited. And also, we must stem from the fact that no society such as ours had co-inhabited so many generations simultaneously and at the same time has been so distant on account of changes in technological and scientific innovation. The millennial generation, followed by the X, Z, Y, and so on generations, are undergoing such fast and rapid transformations that if we do not have a transgenerational dialogue today, we could be surprised by the fact that technology will take us over and nothing planned today will turn out as expected. These compacts must be made today with equal involvement of men and women, necessarily crossed by intersectionality that the document speaks to. Finally, based on state activity, we must innovate, think outside the box. No country of the region has achieved gender equality, and the political changes during 2018 and 19 also teach us that any achievements can be turned around easily. 2019 was a year of political and social upheaval for Latin America and the Caribbean, and our duty in democracy is to channel these conflicts. Let's not forget that democracy is precisely that institutional design that we have adopted to go from conflict to coexistence in harmony, and we must care for it. How to do this? I believe we need to achieve more institutions that reflect based on the experience of women. That is, not only with more women, but more investment, with a key axis considering female experience. And lastly, with the changing economic scenarios, one decisive wager in times of change, and that I do not see in the document because perhaps it's not usually related to economy, but it does have to do with arts.
Art, yes, all of the arts, yes, as a tool for change are important to transform our entourage and culture, perhaps even more powerful than the hard science. We urgently need not only to appeal to reason, but also the emotions of those who listen to us. Lastly, I would like to use this opportunity to just talk about the advancements in Mexico. And I was looking at your list, and I thought, check, check, there we go, check. The government administration of the fourth transformation has as a principle of governance, well-being, honesty, public ethics, as an express mandate to take care, first of all, to disadvantaged populations. No more discretionality of fiscal tax evasion. And with that, the programs of austerity, we hope to have what we need to invest in well-being. At an international level, as it was already said, Mexico has adopted for the first time and very openly the first feminist foreign policies. And the idea is to become active promoters of the global agenda for gender equality. The National Program for Equality Among Women thank you. I wish Marta were here. The National Program for Equality Among Women and Men 2019 to 2014 was made for the first time through a process of active listening that led us to speak with about 5,000 women and 40 entities of the state. This effort has been signed for the agreement by the President of the Republic, Andrés Manuel López Obrador, and the objective is to improve the lives of women in Mexico through 6 main matters that I'd like to sum up as a woman having more time, more employment, more health, safety, equality, and well-being. On the other hand, Mexico went back to the principles of the economy of well-being and not of economic growth in itself. In this sense, Mexico recognizes through a Secretary of Finance and public credit, that this is going to be the engine that will help the economy grow in the next few years. And therefore, we're working with the Secretary of Finance, of Economy, of Labor, in all of these types of actions, from the financial instruments all the way to the whole system of care. So what I want to share with you is that we see in the agenda for gender, the gender agenda is a priority for the government of Mexico, and we want to see it, and it is already included in the programs and budgets. I trust that this document will be a determinant document to be able to come to better agreements with empirical and statistical sustainment. I want to congratulate you for all the work that you've done and for the best and the better future for women in Latin America and the Caribbean.
Muchas gracias, ministra.
Thank you very much, Minister Gassman. Next, I'd like to give the floor to Mariano Noel Baeza, Regional Director for Latin America and the Caribbean for UN Women. Thank you, Madam Chair. It's very difficult for me to speak after Doña Alicia and after Gassman and Epsi and Nadine, because they've put many important things on the table for us to think about, and to reiterate that the document is fantastic, is wonderful, and is going to help us in the next 3 years to be able to truly digest all of the proposals that they're making for us. And we obviously start this today. And we start this today looking to see how we can change the design of public policies and the political pacts. So I think the main political pact was brought to us by Alicia when she said that we can get internal resources within the countries that come from tax evasion and that come from that fiscal condonation that all country has. So if you, ministers of gender, can say to the ministers of economy and finance, leave us and let us get that money together and then give us that money so that we'll be able to finance what we need to empower women and have an economic empowerment and to be able to get out of this economic stagnation, because without the economic participation of women, we won't be able to get out of that. Alicia was very clear about it. Now, let me remind you that we take up only 5% of the CEOs, where only 5% of women are CEOs in Latin America, and only 18% in the boards of directors that decide on the policies of companies. We are working with companies, and this is a tremendous cultural change from UN Women to be able to talk with the entrepreneurs. First of all, they said to us, "Oh, well, I love women. I have 3 daughters." That was the first thing they would say to us. From going to that to please recognize that the participation of women in companies represents an increase of productivity, well, we have to prove it. And I'm very happy with the alliance that we have with ECLAC, because we're going to be able to prove this with the wonderful figures that ECLAC always gives us, these wonderful numbers. I'm not sure how they do it, but they always get their statistics in order. So I think that this year we have so many important events, not just this conference, but also the RCW and the 2 forums that we're going to have in Mexico, but also the high-level segment where all of our presidents are going to be. And that is the opportunity for you to truly be committed. After 25 years of not complying on the Beijing Platform for Action, is very clear that we need political pacts, financial pacts, and no more statements. We need actions. So I want to invite all of you. You have power, even if it's a little bit of power, to convince your presidents to go to New York with concrete proposals of financial inclusion. And Alicia is right. If we do not speak with the bank superintendent, we will not be able to have money to leverage and finance associations, cooperatives, women from grassroots economy, the rural women, indigenous women, descendant from Africa, and poor women who need to get out of the microcredit thing. We cannot continue financing microcredits. We are the one who pay back our loans better than anyone. Why don't you lend us more money? Mr. Bankers, please come back and come to this table, make this fiscal pact and say that's enough. It's time to finance women. If we do not do that this year, which is the year of women, it's the year of equality, I don't think we'll ever do it. Therefore, I invite you to push those ministers of economy and finance so that they will analyze productivity and how productivity would improve with the inclusion of women and how once and for all this discrimination can end and this inequality that we, the women of this region, suffer. I think our veins are still open. As Eduardo Galeano was saying, I think we still have, and Epsi said it very clearly, I think that we have to close that gap, close these inequalities, and stop talking. And on the other hand, I would like to remind you that apart from financial inclusion, we have a new world, which is the investment, social investment, that which is called investment with a focus on gender. But what does this mean? There's an ecosystem. We have standards. Do we know where they are? And who are the investors? Do we? Well, I'll tell you, despite the fact that it goes against our culture and you're in women, we are trying to get into that world. It's the world of fintech, as Alicia was saying. And with only one example, we can reach many, many women. And I want to highlight an idea, a startup, which is a fintech that is dedicated to women who work at home to find employment, the employers and the employees, those who 250,000 women are affiliated to this platform. And after they got jobs, they offer them financial services. For the first time, they were able to have credit. Through one platform, 250,000 women were able to have access to finance with interest rates that are not these usury rates that rural women always get, or indigenous women always get. Therefore, we have to bet on this. We have to talk to these institutions that are being created for investment that want to have a focus on gender, but they don't really understand the proposal for financing. And this is why we have to make a greater effort so that these cooperatives, I know I'm from Uruguay, and there's a lot of cooperatives in Uruguay. I know in other countries the word cooperative is like a rude word, but in small countries like mine, it's the basis of development. What I'm talking about is associations of women, networks of women that will be able to take these projects to that financial world. And in that financial inclusion, that the document of ECLAC invites us to do, we have to have this rapprochement. We have to come closer. I don't want to talk about climate change because you already did a very good job before me. What I do want to remind you is that it's indigenous women, the original peoples women, those are the ones who respect the environment more than anyone. And that is a wonderful asset that we have in Latin America, and we are not giving it its proper value. Most of the projects that are being designed for the Green Fund or for the GF do not bear in mind, do not consider women really. We have to break this. We have to break this idea, break away from that idea. We have to make sure that those projects that reach our countries, that are soft financing, they're grants, donations, we need that the ministers of gender stand up and look at the ministers of the environment and say to them, 50% of those donations has to be given to women. We need to ask the government from every angle these financing. And last but not least, a few years ago, when the private telephone companies started up in some of your countries, because in mine they continue to be public, they started with some special funds that had to have a percentage of their earnings of the cell phones, mobile phones, and mobile phone companies. And those funds are multi-millionaire, sometimes $230 million. You, Madam Minister, do you know where those resources go to? Most of the ministers don't know this. But that's where we have to go to cover the financial gap in technology. It is fundamental for us to look within. Where are those resources? So that we will be able to put an end to the digital gap that women suffer in Latin America. I firmly believe that internal resources as well as external resources are fundamental to be able to bring these things to the table and discuss equality. Because without money, well, you in 25 years, I'm going to be retired, but in 25 years, we're going to be reiterating once again what was not done from the action platform from Beijing. So I'm very happy we're here. I'm very grateful we're here, and I'm very grateful that we are opening up the whole array of subjects that has to do with equality, because equality has to do with 50% of the population of a region, and therefore we have to be at all of those important moments when decisions are being taken and when we can achieve better finance for women. Thank you, Alicia. Thank you for the opportunity to talk here, and thank you, Madam Chair, for having us here in this wonderful city of Santiago de Chile, and thank you all for being here. Thank you, Maria Noel, and thank you. I want to thank UN Women through you and Regional Women's and the office in Chile because of all of the backup that they've given us for the organization of this conference, close to ECLAC. And next, I'd like to give the floor to Alicia Bárcena for a very special comment. I would like to recognize three magnificent women here who are in the room. Rebecca Greenspan, the Secretary of SEGIP. Alejandra Mora Mora, Secretary of the Inter-American Committee for Women of the OAS. And Maria Fernandez Espinosa. I'm very happy to welcome her, and as she will not be able to accompany us in the next few days, we've invited her to say a few words because Maria Fernanda, for those of you who don't know her, she was the first Latin American woman and who was able to reach the General Assembly, and she was the first chairperson, and she promoted from there, from the General Assembly, the World Pact for Migration, Generation, and Equality. She launched this whole matter of women in power, positions of power. And there we go. And more than that. And justice, action for climate justice, which has been one of her causes that she's been backing up. And so I've been so bold as to invite her, Madam Minister, because Maria Fernanda right now is an important candidate for the OAS. And we would love to have a woman there. We would really like to have a woman there. 71 years. 71 years of the OAS. We've never had a woman as a chair. So you have the floor, and thank you, Madam Minister. Well, I'm almost ashamed. And with a great deal of humility and modesty, all I can do is really thank you for this new report that ECLAC has given us. We've heard several readings of what it means. It means a lot for us. Numbers, figures, tendencies, guidelines, and guidances with regards to the autonomy of women in changing scenarios. I am a geographer, and what I have learned is it's more and less. That was very clear. The whole matter is about those who have more and those who have less. That's what I heard. And unfortunately, in our case, the case of women, those who have more the mores are more poverty, more violence, more victims of climate change, more victims of human trafficking. And when we have the minus or less is less money, less opportunities, less rights, less time, less investment. And in the pluses or the mores, we have more discrimination, more racism. And I think that the responsibility that we have in this hemisphere and the responsibility that we have at a world level is to make those pluses and minuses become more rights, more dignity, more opportunity. And I think that this is a privileged year because of this conference, but also because what's coming, the forum under the leadership of Mexico, the forum under the leadership of France. I must say that when we were negotiating the modalities for the Beijing Plus 25, it was a very complicated negotiation, very complicated. Now, finally, we have this mandate, the mandate of 193 states to be able to have a loud and clear voice, as you have said. The subject matters for the forum are there. In Mexico and in France, they're on the table. And I think it has a lot to do with economic empowerment of women, which is the matter that we're here for. So I think that together we can make history, and together in diversity, but also in the great challenges that we will be facing. So I want to thank ECLAC once again for all of their help, and thank you, Alicia, and thank you not only the representatives and ministers of the governments of the hemisphere, but also really, thank you very much. I want to thank the representatives of civil society who are here. You are the engine behind what we are harvesting, but also things that we are dreaming about to be able to get in the future. So thank you for permitting me to take the floor, dear Alicia and ministers. Thank you very much.
Muy bien.
Very well, thank you, and special greetings, Maria Fernanda, to you. And now we will open up for discussions among the countries here. We have very little time, so I propose that we open up debate for 6 interventions by no more than 3 to 5 minutes. The floor is open. Countries? Very well. The Minister of Argentina is recognized. Thank you. Good afternoon, everyone. I come from Argentina for the first time, representing us with a new institutionality. As of December the 10th, 2019, for the first time, we created the Ministry of Women, Gender, and Diversity. I'm sure you can imagine that on the one hand, this implies a great honor, but also a great responsibility. Above all, because the creation of this ministry, well, we have no doubt, basically is an account of 2 matters. On the one hand, the collective struggle of recent years, which became mass struggles thanks to the women and feminist movements in the country, but also historically. Argentina has a vast history of feminist movements and that we especially recognize. Many of these today are part of the women representing the civil society, and we're also very proud of that. I'd like to say that those struggles were the main driver against neoliberalism in recent years, resulting undoubtedly in one of the main dynamic actors. I was thinking of the ECLAC report that speaks of the changing economic scenarios, but these are the regressive changing economic scenarios. If they were progressive, we would be closer to reducing the inequality gaps that the report so well details. And also, this conquer, while the economy expelled women from the labor market, and these women took to the street and led to the power that meant that today Argentina has had to create a new institutionality. And today I'm honored to represent it, but also it put up an agenda, the rights and the autonomy of women. I was listening to Maria Noel and Alicia to speak of, on the one hand, public policy and also political compacts. And of course, that also resulted in a clear political decision by the new government. There you have the new political agreements. And that also, when the president, Alberto Fernandez, came into power on December the 10th, in his inaugural speech, announced that one of the central tasks of this new government was to reduce inequality gaps, something that had not been said and put up on the political agenda before. And to end, because there are a few minutes that we have, we are convinced of how essential it is to reappreciate the value of the state, the value of what is public, and aside from the tremendous work done and continued to be done by the civil society, social movements, and co-ops that are very relevant in my country as well as in Uruguay, this is the task of the state. These are competences of the state, and that it is necessary to begin thinking on how to undo these inequality gaps. This will also have a direct impact on the agenda of violence. And undoubtedly, this regional forum that convenes us and allows us to think of common strategies, common roadmaps, the reports that have been presented here, these are essential because we, too, brothers and sisters of Latin America and the Caribbean, are undoubtedly aware that history has shown that violence and inequality affect us all equally. So thank you very much, Chair and colleagues here at ECLAC. Thank you. Thank you, Minister Gomez. And now we recognize the representative of Guatemala, the government of Guatemala. Good afternoon. My name is Mina Gonzalez, Private Secretary of the Vice Presidency of the Republic of Guatemala. I would like to say thank you to those who make it possible for this very important conference, regional conference, to be held, especially UN Women, ECLAC, the authorities and the people of Chile for welcoming us in this very pleasant country, and all countries who are part of this important conference. My presentation will focus on three very specific aspects. First, reiterate and confirm that the inequality that societies experience is the result of an historical evolution of exclusion, and so that is how it should be seen. That is why the government of the Republic of Guatemala, specifically this administration that began a few weeks back, aims to promote the autonomy of women. And the role of science and technology is essential for this purpose. Second, as a woman, citizen, indigenous and rural woman, and now a public employee, I dare invite women of the region and countries to enhance strategic partnerships, to work together in the eradication of inequality, in addition to seeing it as a problem of one or two countries. This is a widespread issue at regional level and must be seen as such. the more we are, and together we will achieve more. And so, with the evidence and the figures highlighted here, the role of ECLAC, it is possible, or we can move towards an agenda for social development where women propose and decide. And second, I would like to second what was said by Maria Noel regarding the relevance of making visible the role and important contribution made by indigenous women to the development of countries. I was careful to review the agenda in hand, and if I'm wrong, please correct me. I saw no topic identifying or making visible the role, contribution, and problems and challenges faced by indigenous women in the region. And so therefore, I propose that for the follow-up of this conference, this regional conference, we may give space to the role of women and the sustainable development of our countries with grounds, evidence, data. Women, indigenous women, we also count. And if our position is not made relevant, we will not have the opportunities nor the evidence to be able to affect even us, the indigenous officers in our governments. Thank you. Thank you. As chair, I pick up the suggestion made by the representative of the government of Guatemala regarding the inclusion in the Santiago Commitment, a very explicit mention of the contribution, the economic contribution, and since we're talking about the economic empowerment of women, the contribution made by the indigenous women in Guatemala and the whole of Latin America and the Caribbean to sustainable development and the economy of our countries. Thank you. And now the representative of Cuba is recognized. Good afternoon, and thank you, Madam Chair. First, I'd like to congratulate our Argentine friends for the success of having already a Ministry of Women. Undoubtedly, the battle now begins to achieve public policy favoring the rights of women. And also, I'd like to thank ECLAC and referring to the matter, the progress made with the Montevideo strategy and the challenges imposed by changing economic scenarios, we must say that in the case of our small island, in our modest experience, despite the criminal blockade that we've suffered, we resist, and not only resist, but also develop. And so, therefore, all of these challenges have led to the implementation of public policies that favor the advancement of women that we have seen in the country. You put an example, and I would like to pick it up again, and that is that there is a public policy that speaks of a bonus of 50% of the tax to be paid by mothers that have 2 children up to the age of 17 and that are self-employed, an activity that has become flexible in the country, and now we have more than 34% of women who are working in this activity, women that have the same labor rights as those women who work in the state sector. For example, I'm referring the right to maternity leave, even with benefits, because they contribute to social security. And also there are other public policies that provide bonuses because there are women that care for children and the elderly. And they are paid a wage because they're making a social contribution. This is for women with children who are bedridden or have severe disability. And so the state pays them a benefit for these people to care for these children. And that is also recognition of the unpaid work. The same thing is done with people who are selected in the country and that care for the elderly. These are policies that have shown the validity of the Montevideo strategy and that have allowed us to use all of these instruments that are offered here based on the situation in the country to have these public policies. Likewise, in Cuba, we have also just done an audit of SDG 5 because the Montevideo strategy allows us to integrate it to other documents that are international. And these international commitments that Cuba maintains, it is because of the will to favor the advancement of women. And on account of this ability to transform that our women have within the country in the spheres of economy, politics, and society, all of these measures are practical measures. We are doing this gender audit done by the Office of the Comptroller General of the Republic. This was recognized by the international agency that encouraged these audits. And we began with SDG 5, and this was classified as favorable within the country. And we've also identified challenges where we will have to continue working on. Each achievement implies a challenge that we will have to work on. We have the political will and an interrelation. But without any doubt, the most important achievement that we've had after the Montevideo strategy is the participation of our women in parliament, because there we represent 53.22%. And this has not just been because we've put intention into it, but because of the leadership of our women with the development of the country was recognized by everyone. And quite recently, we elected governors and intendants, and the participation of women, it was higher. When we access this, we double click because we still have challenges. And the Constitution of the Republic that has just been adopted by 86% of the population is clear. The political will of all people, because it was a constitution written by all people, it includes gender equality, and it's brought to constitutional rank the prevention of gender violence. In Cuba today, it is part of the Constitution, and so therefore we need to adapt the rules, the legal rules in the country in order to respond to what is enshrined in the Constitution. We need to protect our women, our girls, and the families, because this is included as such. Thank you for giving me this possibility. Thank you. Thank you, Minister of Cuba. And now, the Vice Minister, Sandra Palicio, Vice Minister for Foreign Trade and Integration of the Ministry of Foreign Affairs of Bolivia, is recognized. Good afternoon, Chairman. Congratulations, because today we are part of this conference. We wish you every success as chair. At the same time as Bolivia, we feel honored to be here today with all of you and say which have been the advancements and the differences that we face today in our country. First, I would like to thank ECLAC and UN Women for making it possible for us to be here, and say that in past months, Bolivia has changed its current government. This is a transition government that we have right now because, thanks to a peaceful movement of women and young people, we are working to develop women with our public policy and have autonomy of economy in households and for the country. Right now, we are working on public policy to develop even further everything related to women's economy, but enhancing entrepreneurial women and professional women and business women. At the same time, we were working in the various levels of training, education, and an economy based on the leadership of women. For the economy and other sectors of the economy, of the country. We'd also like to mention our public and private projects ongoing in Bolivia. We would like to say that the government's and foreign office's approach is to project women in various economic, health, and education and social schemes so that inequality gaps may be each time less and have a balance within the economy. And then at constitutional level, the women are mentioned, and our first chancellor is a woman as well. We have scale economies to be created, maybe not at a political level. We're not working on this at a political level, but we are working based on our convictions. Convictions that we hold as women. We are working for and by women. I come from the private sectors. For more than 20 years, we have been enhancing women in the private sector as well as the most needy sectors in society. But we do this with conviction, as I repeat, not political level, because that is not our interest. Today, we have come to learn from other countries in order to have public policy in our country to make our growth sustainable and help us to integrate to our social structure all these successful experiences of other countries and that we may implement in Bolivia. And so I merely would like to offer you our full support and say that we are totally involved with all activities and would like to congratulate you for this document drafted that contains so very important information and very relevant data that will help us to improve the strategic quality that we would like to implement in the structure supporting women in Bolivia. Thank you.
Muchas gracias, viceministra Aparicio, y muchas gracias.
Thank you very much for accompanying us at this conference of Bolivia. Next, we give the floor to the representative of El Salvador.
Gracias. Disculpen. Buenas tardes a todas y felicitaciones. Voy a hacer.
Good afternoon. I'm going to be very brief. I want to share as good news with you a few things. So I want to tell you that with the new government that we have, which is Bukele, for the first time in El Salvador, we have many female ministers. We have ministers of local housing, health, culture. And so we're very happy with these possibilities for change. And from the Institute of Women that I preside, we have also incorporated the whole matter of indigenous, rural, and women. And we are making the other types of violence that we suffer in the region visible. We're going to work hand in hand with Mexico on matters that have to do with migration and forced migration that due to reasons of internal violence, and this is why there's migration. So I just wanted to share with you very briefly these good news that we've also worked hand in hand with the government of Guatemala. And yesterday, the skies opened up. And now we're in a route, a different kind of route, to empower women much more. Thank you.
Bueno, con esto queda cerrada la lista de...
So with this, we finish with the list of, well, one more person. Venezuela, you have the floor. Good afternoon. Very well. From Venezuela, we would like to greet you. Want to greet everyone who's in this event and also all of the board of directors who has been in charge of this organization, civil society is present. It's always necessary to listen to the people in these spaces. It's always necessary to listen to the people. That is an everyday type of practice that we have in Venezuela. That's why our government is it's always in contact with civil society, civil movements, as we call them, with the popular power of women. We have advanced a great deal in Venezuela in the last few years. And this advancement that we did not have before, for example, now we have political parity, something that we don't see in many nations, but we have conquered it. We have a constitution that recognizes equality and equity between men and women. And we've gone so far as equality in salaries and wages, especially, principally, mainly in public jobs. That's part of the advancement that we've had in Venezuela. There's many other things I'm sure you know about. We always reiterate, such as political participation of our women in our communities, where more than 70% of women that lead all forms of organization in our communities, and they are empowered. And right now, Venezuelan women are those who resist with greater strength to all of the war that is being waged against our country. These are the people who go to the street and go out and work, and they go out every day to propose new strategies. And this is why we are accompanying them day by day. And our government obviously is a government that calls itself feminist. That's why we have a special day for our women, which is the 25th of October. Currently, we are modifying our constitution through the National Assembly, and we're also changing and modifying the law to protect women. Let me correct myself. To have a life free of violence. And through this, in 2014, we'd already included 2 forms, apart from the 19 that we had in the other law. 2 other forms of violence were included into the law, such as femicide and obstetric violence. And at this point now, we're also studying in this new advancement to include other forms of violence, such as cyber harassment and cyber violence that we are studying, and we're putting it into our law now. And also parity in our constitution. This is part of the work and strategies that we are using from our Venezuelan government to be able to give support to women in our country. With regards to financial matters, that we've already said, in our country, Venezuela, there is a fund which is called the Bank for Development for Women, and for the last 20 years that has helped women, the poorest women, to become empowered, especially women who have been victims of violence. It is a wonderful experience. It's enriching. This fund is still active, and our government goes to great extremes to keep it up and running, and we are willing to share this experience from our communities and from the vision of our women, who are the protagonists of this action. So, with no more ado, I would like to thank the participation of everyone, and we're going to continue walking hand in hand with our women, the women of Latin America, and the empowerment of the women of the working classes. Thank you very much. The Secretariat has made a note that there are others who want to take the floor, but they'll be able to take the floor tomorrow. And the last point that we have today, well, you know, throughout the day yesterday the 27th, we had the meeting of the Forum of Feminist Movements of Latin America and the Caribbean within the framework of this conference. And they've made a statement that will be read by their spokesperson that was chosen by themselves, Ms. Madariaga. You have the floor, please. Hello. As civil society, we want to greet and thank the organization of ECLAC and UN Women in this regional conference on women, and I'm going to read my declaration. We insist, we resist, and we advance. Beijing is 25 years old now. The 4th World Conference of Women was not just another conference. We went there with accumulated experience and the advancements that we had done before, especially the Conference of Vienna, where for the first time the rights of women were recognized as human rights, and in the Conference of Cairo, where the reproductive rights were included. And we left open the door for sexual rights. And here we are, 25 years later. And now we insist on the following. To ratify the platform of action in Beijing, as well as the agendas of Rio, Vienna, Cairo, and Durban, as roadmaps, reivindicating the role that we have played, we, the movements, women's movements and feminist movements, have had in the building, sustaining of these agendas. And we call on the states, governments, and various social players to become part of us in recognizing equality as a good and a horizon for mankind. Feminist organizations and organizations of women manifest our concern for the political and economic context in the region, as well as the rest of the world. It's an economic system that is predatory, extractivist, not only of nature, but also of work, whether paid or non-paid, of time, of lands, of natural resources, and of bodies. The current patterns of extractivism, production, and consumption are incompatible with the sustainability of life. We see this in the social resistance in the region, with an active presence of feminism in the articulation of social movements that fight for justice, racial, ethnic, generational, and economic, as well as gender. And we raise our voices to be able to face the mercantilization of life. Therefore, we resist and we reivindicate the right for social protest, which should not become a crime. We reject that because we oppose these mega projects. We should not become responsible. We're not responsible for insufficiencies in the social economic development. Let us not let extractivism make our lands and territories what patriarchy does to our bodies. And therefore, we reivindicate our organization. We reivindicate our growing organization from the grassroots organizations, the community, indigenous, migrant, young, Afro-descended, trade unionists, and of urban and rural women. We resist and we defy the linguistic barriers and the structural inequalities that reproduce precarious conditions of life and extreme poverty. We are used to repeat that Latin America and the Caribbean is the region with the greatest inequality of the world. And now we're going to get used to saying that we are also the region with the most powerful feminism of this planet. Our permanent activism, resistance, and defense of rights is expressed in the framework of states and democracies that are weakened and fragile, where conservatism is installed, which is able to criminalize and repress social protests. To defend human rights and defending our land has become of high risk. And in this context, we resist. We are now discussing cultural matters, and gender equality is facing the risk of going backwards, faced with misogynist, lesbo, trans, homophobic, racist, and colonial patriarchy that is expressed fundamentally in religious, political, and economic and cultural matters. Now more than anywhere, we reivindicate the state with no religion within the framework of the advancement of human rights for women and children. Within this context, we ratify our position that democracy without discrimination nor any kind of exclusion is a basic condition to be able to be a citizen and human rights. Therefore, it is fundamental to ensure conditions that will make participation of civil society a possibility, especially that of the feminist and women's organizations. We will continue to move forward. From the approval of the platform of the Beijing Action, we have moved forward. Nevertheless, what we have achieved is very little, and our challenges remain, and we need the articulation of the state, social society, multilateral organizations, and others. Therefore, we demand from the states that the commitments should be transformed into concrete actions in favor of equality and the rights of women, and to have enough resources to be able to make these policies move forward with progressive mechanisms that will guarantee the redistribution of income and wealth. We demand legal, safe, free abortions in the whole region. Its penalization and obstaculization must be seen as violence that comes from the states, because the sexual rights and the right to reproduce are human rights. We demand that the bodies of women should stop being a territory of conquest for repressors. We want to stop all kinds of repression, including sexual violence, as political and military control in the midst of crisis in our countries, especially due to the aggressions that have happened to the Chileans and people from Nicaragua in response to the migration crisis. We demand that the states will be accountable about the obligations that they have on an international level and the recommendations in the human rights organs with which they have committed. We insist that we should understand once and for all, peace without women is not sustainable, nor is not sustainable at all, and without any proper justice, there is no way that we will be able to build a peaceful society. We demand from the state that they should guarantee the political participation of women, lesbian, transvestites, bisexuals, and people trans and non-binary should be able to be without being afraid of any kind of violence or problems, so that all women, especially those that are descended from Africa and indigenous, will be able to participate in the governance of the states in a paritary way, an egalitarian way. We call upon the governments to recognize that the models of development that have been built on the expoliation limit the possibilities for economic autonomy of women, especially of girls, indigenous women, Afro-descendant women, migrants, and that includes sexual workers from the sexogeneric dissidents, those who live with handicaps and who live with HIV. We want to eliminate racism and institutional xenophobia, establishing policies with intersectional perspectives and support in public services, support for women, black girls, migrants, indigenous girls, and especially anyone who is discriminated against because of their race or ethnic group. We demand that attention be given to climate change in all of the region, emphasizing the Caribbean. We exhort the states to adopt the necessary measures to eliminate the problems of reproduction that create economic inequality, guaranteeing access to proper jobs. We want to have food safety and free access to sport, and to promote to organizations to take care of social responsibilities, access to public services, access to education, including sexual education and social infrastructure in all its levels. We demand to move forward immediately to eradicate all forms of violence against women, especially femicide. and nocive practices. And therefore, we say that sexual violence, marriages and forced pregnancies in girls and adolescents should not occur again. To guarantee a life free of violence is a task that cannot be delayed. We demand immediate attention to discrimination, violence, and harassment that women face in the work area, especially members of the press, because the transformation of the media and digital communication and its sexist point of view is necessary to pay attention to this so that we can achieve the cultural transformation that we aspire to. Beijing continues to be our agenda, and we demand its compliance without it being simplified or reduced at all. Today, the states state they don't want to leave anyone behind. But we are coming here to insist that we resist and we advance, and that we are the ones who do not accept any step backwards, and we're not going to let anyone leave us behind. Nothing about us without us.
Muchas gracias.
Thank you very much. And we now wrap up our work of this first day of the 14th Regional Conference on Women. And we invite you to enjoy the cocktail that will be offered outside before the Carmelo Soria plate downstairs. And tomorrow, work resumes here at 9 a.m. and countries in the technical meeting for facilitation of the Santiago commitment at 9 a.m., but in the Celso Furtado room. Thank you.
De los pueblos indígenas no está la Convención de los Pueblos Indígenas. Mencionaste